actually there's no real public health justification. This is pure stigmatization of people who want to smoke.
Broadly speaking, a liberal is somebody who is right-wing on economics and left-wing on social issues. It's no longer true today, though, because nowadays, as liberals, would you say you're left-wing on social issues? No, nowadays, left-wing on social issues in favor of cancel culture, woke authoritarianism.
Considering, for example, whether you should earn more for working in a warehouse because the background noise makes it hard to have conversations, or whether you're more likely to be lonely as a warehouse worker than someone working in a shop and interacting with customers. This is just completely insane.
Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Reem Ibrahim, the IEA's Acting Director of Communications. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, our Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, our Editorial Director. We bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to get beyond the headlines and instead focus on the big ideas and foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. So we heard a few announcements this week, some from the government intentionally and some not. Tom is going to be discussing the equal pay judgment against Next. I am going to decipher why the nanny state just won't stop. And Kristian is going to tell us a little bit about why it is people stop believing in freedom. Tom, why don't you kick us off with the first topic?
Yeah, so this week we learned that an employment tribunal had decided that Next, the retailer, should have been paying its mostly female shop workers the same as its slim majority warehouse workers, claiming that the work was of equal value. This could cost Next £30 million in back pay. There are clear parallels with a much larger case that was decided against the Birmingham City Council, which drove them basically into bankruptcy, where the tribunal decided that they should have been paying cleaners the same as refuse collectors, basically. Now, there's an awful lot of different aspects to this story that I think could be interesting to explore, like the fact, for example, that this stuff is all rooted in a 1983 EU directive, which maybe that, after Brexit, something should have been done about. There are a lot of different facts, but I think the most interesting one for me, and maybe for the Institute of Economic Affairs, is that you would think when a tribunal was trying to decide whether work was of equal value, economic reasoning would be an important part of that process. And in fact, if you look at the judgment and other judgments in this area, economic reasoning does not factor into this question in any way whatsoever. And I suppose that's inevitable, right? Because if you were reasoning this as an economist, you would say, how much are they being paid? Oh, they're being paid differently. Clearly the work is not of equal value, as the market has revealed. It's a factor of supply and demand, and people's different preferences for different workplaces and styles of work, and so on. But this is not at all how this works legally. They will basically look, these tribunals, at the demands made on employees in different roles by reference to factors such as effort, skill, and decision-making. That's from the Equality Act 2010. And just reading through a few of these judgments, skimming through them, it's kind of extraordinary, the circles that these judges, and they're not all judges, it's normally one judge, I think, and two lay people making these decisions at this level, the kind of logical circles they run around in, considering, for example, whether you should earn more for working in a warehouse because the background noise makes it hard to have conversations, or whether you're more likely to be lonely as a warehouse worker than someone working in a shop and interacting with customers, and so on. This is just completely insane from my point of view. Another little tidbit that I picked up from our colleague Len Shackleton's piece for CapEx is that many large businesses like Next, like other retailers, and the big retailers are basically all facing these claims, by the way, because as a rule, warehouse workers have been paid more than people working in the stores. But big employers have to do these things called, work evaluation schemes. And so they'll handsomely pay some consultants to come in and look at their workforce and look at the different roles and try and weigh up the way a court would weigh up what the different value of those roles is, and then make sure that the pay scales conform to that kind of legalistic opinion. Again, what a complete load of nonsense. And I've got to admit, I didn't know that it was like that. In fact, the more kind of issues of employment law I encounter, the more I think, surely it can't work this way. This sounds completely crazy. And yet I think systematically, businesses large and small are just being tied up in this extraordinary amount of red tape. And surely at some point, this is going, I mean, I think it probably already is having a significant negative economic effect. But the further and further this advances, the more we move away from having anything like a free market in labour, the more significant, the worse the consequences of that are going to be. So I guess I learned something, and I learned that it's even worse than I thought.
So it's very, very, very bad state of affairs. I was going to say, I think it's interesting from that perspective because there are a lot of areas of employment law in which your MRP or marginal revenue product isn't what decides your economic value, and so you actually end up with huge swathes of that, and it looks as though it's probably going to get worse with the New Deal for working people that the Labour government are very likely to implement. That also includes reputational risk. So things like currently we have compulsory gender pay gap reporting for companies with more than 250 employees. Then we're almost always going to see that men are being paid more on average based on the number of hours worked and that kind of thing. And I think this just comes back to that principle that there are so many different factors that decide somebody's wages or somebody's salary, and we can't possibly know what all of those intricate reasons be.
This is basically how Soviet planners would have tried to work out pay scales in a non-market economy, right?
Well, yeah, quite. If judges could make a decision like that reasonably well, why wouldn't economic planning in general work? Why wouldn't you decide wages across the economy in this way? But I think this is one of those stories which quite starkly reveal the difference between how an economist approaches these things and how a non-economist thinks about these things. That I've seen all the arguments about this, and this isn't the first time. There were stories of this kind before. Is always the non-economist thinks of remuneration as a kind of moral judgment. So if, say, Group A earns less than Group B, for the average Joe, this implies a value judgment. It's as if somebody has made the judgment that these people somehow deserve less in a moral sense. Whereas we would think of it as simply, as you said, supply and demand. This is completely amoral. Nobody's passing judgment of value in a philosophical sense on anything. It's just that if I buy this product rather than that product, then that will way lead to some people earning more money than they otherwise would have, some people in the economy earning less money than they otherwise would have, and there's no moral judgment involved. This is really just blind amoral economic forces that are at work. But it's just hard to challenge that intuition, and I'd say even for a trained economist, sometimes you just see reporting of relative wage differences where you wouldn't immediately know the difference, and you just have this intuition. This feels somehow wrong. If this is hard to challenge that intuition, even for us, then imagine what it must be like for normal people.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think just on that point, there are a whole host of unintended consequences that could result as a result of these kind of judgments, but also this notion that pay should be equal across the board depending on the type of work, and this kind of completely removes this notion that actually there are so many different differentials that decide one person's pay. And even just thinking about what the government are looking potentially to do in the future with equal pay and compulsory reporting, it would probably actually see a lot of the results that you just mentioned, Tom. This notion that actually we might be seeing a lot of companies trying to sort of shift what those headline rates look like, what those headline gaps look like, and instead trying to reduce it, and so outsourcing lower paid work, outsourcing work that is traditionally done by lower paid people, or indeed actually preventing them from promoting women, for example, from junior positions into the business, they would be much less likely to hire women at lower paid jobs. So again, there are so many different elements to this, and they're probably also going to be doing that for ethnic minorities as well. So
so that is part of the government's plans to extend this concept of equal pay for equal value work, not identical work, to people with disabilities, so different ethnic groups and everything as well. So I think we're probably just going to see this really ramp up in the coming years.
Let's move on to my topic, the nanny state that is effectively incrementally increasing and intervening in all of our lives. I am an avid pub goer, and I am very distraught, was very distraught to hear that the government are looking at and considering plans to ban smoking outdoor various different venues. So that includes outdoor pubs. It also includes nightclubs, so the smoking areas and nightclubs, some small parks, outdoor restaurants. And I think that just from a first principles basis, from a sort of classical liberal perspective, this is morally wrong, right? I think that as a private venue, you should completely be allowed to decide the parameters in which you allow people to smoke on, or indeed, if you would like to serve food at that particular venue, or if you would like people to smoke outdoors, or if you would like people to smoke 10 meters away on your own property. I think all of these things should be decided by those particular venues. I do accept that a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that perspective. But then what this does do is it will hurt the hospitality industry, and it will have hugely disastrous effects on many of them. We remember back in 2006 with the indoor smoking ban. This is effectively an extension of that ban, and we saw huge impacts on various different venues. We saw a drop in the number of smokers that went to those particular industries. So before the ban, 54% of pub customers were smokers, and this dropped to 38% after the ban. And there was a net reduction of 74% in smokers' visits to pubs. So we knew that a lot of those particular people were avid pub goers in the first place. And as a result, we saw a huge reduction in them, and we saw huge pub closures. A quarter of pubs have closed since the start of this century. And the fact of the matter is, I think pubs are such a key part of British culture, but also just from that moral perspective, we are hurting an industry that is already on its knees after experiencing the pandemic and experiencing incredibly high business rates and various other economic consequences and economic situations. Actually means that they're going to be suffering regardless. Now, I want to caveat this with, I accept that smoking is bad for you. I think we all do. I think every adult that smokes is very aware of that fact. But if we want to be, from a public health perspective, reducing the impact of tobacco and reducing harm, we should be looking at other countries that have done a very good job at this. I think Sweden is a perfect example. They have been able to effectively achieve what we might call smoke-free, or what the EU would call smoke-free, which is an adult smoking population that is less than 5%. And they've done that not by banning outdoor smoking, not by banning or incrementally increasing the age of sale of tobacco, as the government, the previous government wished to do, and this government probably will do. But they've done it by allowing adults to choose safer and healthier products. And we know that e-cigarettes are more than 95% less harmful than traditional cigarettes, than traditional combustibles. And the fact that adults are now allowed to make those choices and choose products like snus, which is very popular in Sweden, has meant that they've been able to significantly reduce their smoking rates. So even from a moral perspective, from an industry perspective, from a public health perspective, these are really bad policies.
And the thing about this is that there's no real empirical justification for it, right? Actually, there's no real public health justification. This is pure stigmatization of people who want to smoke because they're outdoors, right? They know, first of all, know what they're doing. Secondly, they're outdoors. Any kind of secondary effects were not worth bothering about. I mean, I was just reflecting on, why does this enrage me so much? Like, I'm not a smoker. I've never been a smoker. I was opposed to the smoking ban, though I will admit that I've quite enjoyed its effect. Not having to hang my clothes out of the window for 3 days, etc., etc. I can take my four-year-old to pubs for lunch and stuff. That's nice too, which I probably wouldn't have done in the old days. But why do I find this so irritating? It's just the principle of the thing. This is simply put something that the government should not be involved in. They have no business determining whether people are allowed to do something that harms themselves outdoors on private premises. And it's not even like there is the sort of the argument that says, well, smokers, you get lung cancer and then they cost the NHS money. I mean, they do, but they pay way more than that in the tax revenue on cigarettes and everything. So this is purely nannying. This is interfering with private property owners, with private businesses, and with individuals doing something which is still, the last time I checked, legal, although, of course, the government is trying to change that, or various governments, not this one in particular. I mean, that's a funny point, right, that the British Conservative Party immediately came out condemning this awful nanny state measure, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they proposed a generational tobacco ban not that long ago.
Yeah, it is absolutely. I actually had I won't name, a Conservative MP text me yesterday after the announcement, said, "Isn't this terrible?" And I sort of said, "You voted for the original ban."
Pure vibes.
It's pure vibes. I think it's really interesting because obviously the previous government, led by the Conservatives, sort of set the precedent for this kind of intervention, and we always knew that things would end up going further. We know that the history of the nanny state, from a sort of wider perspective, we've got the sugar tax, we've got various different increasing regulations on advertisements for vapes and that kind of thing. So we know this is already happening. We know that the government are intervening in our lives continuously. We also know that a lot of the British public want this. A lot of the British public like this. Freedom isn't necessarily something that the British public are in favour of. And indeed, it seems to me that especially post-pandemic, the British public are, in general at least, very happy to take on further government intervention and very happy for the government to tell them what they can and cannot do with their own bodies. Again, despite all of the evidence showing that this policy is probably not going to work, or indeed, if it does have any impact on smoking rates, there are other ways that would have been a lot more effective. Kristian, could you tell me why people don't like freedom anymore?
I can't really, but in this case, they really don't. So I said this yesterday on Twitter, mostly as a joke, where I said, I bet this is going to be popular. I bet there will be a poll soon showing that there's majority support for this. Then somebody replied, well, yes, there already is. 58% of the public are in favor of it. But that's often the case with nanny statism.
How many people wanted to permanently close nightclubs after the pandemic?
It's more than 50%.
Yeah, right.
Well, it was a non-trivial percentage. That's always the case. I remember the original, the debates around the original indoor smoking ban, and was it 2006? Around that time, where I did say at the time that this is the ratchet effects. This is not going to end there. And I was told, well, you're just being paranoid. That it ends there. They're going to ban it indoors. But if you absolutely must smoke, if you insist, well, just go outside. What's the big deal? What's the problem here? And for a while, it did seem to end there, so that there were no further obvious measures for a while. And I even thought, well, maybe I was overly cautious at the time, but, well, here we are. It's a long-term ratchet effect. The original smoking ban, there you could at least steelman the argument. You could say, okay, on property rights grounds, I'm against it. But you could say, well, if, say, imagine pubs were invented today, surely there would be both smoker and non-smoker pubs. There would be some pubs that would just say right from the outset, you can't smoke here, and that would be that, because there is just a large non-smoking population, that including people who go to the pub. And it was just a bit of a legacy effect that, there was a time, I think in the 70s, when more than half of the population smoked, where that was really extremely common. And then you just have a problem. You don't want to be the first pub that says, okay, until yesterday or until today it was possible to smoke here. From today on, you no longer can. And you have to have people running around the pub telling everyone, no, go outside, and putting away the ashtrays and whatever. That would just be that, say, if we had a smoking ban for 10 years and then reversed it, a lot of pubs would remain non-smoking pubs, because there's a path dependency and you're just used to doing things in that way now. With this one, I don't even see how you can steelman it. It's not the case where Back then, part of the justification was realistically, if you're the smoker, just go outside. It's not that big a deal. It's 3 meters to the door, but it makes a huge difference to the non-smoker inside. Whereas in this case, if you're standing outside and if the smoke bothers you, just step back a bit. And and it's quite pure nannying, as you said. But what I often find irritating about nannying debates is that you don't even find honest proponents of nanny statism these days anymore. I can't remember the last time somebody openly said, yes, I believe in the nanny state. I think I know better than most people. I'm smarter. I think most people lack impulse control. I'll force you to do what's good for you. You will hate me, but you will thank me in the end. And you don't get that honest nanny statism anymore.
That would be refreshing. If we can find someone with that point of view, we'll have them in here and they can talk to Chris. I mean, the point I want to make on this actually is that, yes, okay, when you poll a measure like this, you get weak majority, well, not majority support, but a weak plurality of support, right? So I was like 35% of people think this is fine, 20% of people think it's a bad idea. Those are not
people don't care.
The rest of people don't care. Those are not exact numbers. And that does probably, remind you of that famous quote that democracy is the theory that people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. But also, I think it's misleading. It's misleading because I don't think anyone is voting or anyone is writing to their members of parliament or whatever, or for that matter, that anyone is entering politics and standing for election because they want to ban smoking outside pubs. If you asked, if you did another sort of standard type of poll where you gave people, 20 different policies that the government could implement and asked them to rank them in order of priority, I'm fairly certain that this would be at the bottom or near the bottom. And so it's the kind of thing that even if people weakly support it, it never should actually rise to the point of political action, because it should never be that important. And there are always more important things that the government ought to be doing. So where does this come from? What are the political dynamics behind this? And I think this is it comes from the bureaucracy. And it comes from the NGO sector that the bureaucracy funds to lobby the bureaucracy, to constantly have these slippery slope nannying policies ready to go, to foist them on whichever government is in charge, to give them an easy announcement or a bit of publicity or whatever on demand. There is this whole, our colleague Chris Snowden wrote about sock puppets a few years ago. And I think that that's a really good way of thinking about it. But we've created basically this industry that constantly pushes the ratchet effect further and further and further. And it really operates without much political intervention or direction or popular mandate or democratic impulse or anything. This is basically a project of a kind of elite bureaucracy imposing their views and their preferences on other people. And it's just going to continue. It's going to continue whichever government is in charge, most likely, unless you just say, this whole thing is fake. It has nothing to do with public health. Public health is about things like pandemics. You remember those? We had one quite recently. Or vaccinations or sanitation and that kind of thing. Things that affect the public at large. If some individual wants to smoke a cigarette outside, for goodness sake, let them. Let's not pay people however much we're paying them. And I know in the grand scheme of things, it's trivial in fiscal terms. That's not the argument. But the argument is we as taxpayers are keeping these arguments and these policies alive and keeping them going. And we don't need to. It serves no useful purpose.
Absolutely. I think the increasing intervention of the nanny state is the politics of doing something. It's the government that can sort of look back at these kind of policies and know that they are there, that they can be showing the public that they are doing something about this really bad problem. So Keir Starmer could this week stand up and say, I am doing something. So Rishi Sunak attempted to use the incremental increase in the age of sale of tobacco as his legacy. His legacy would have been, I'm the Prime Minister that bans smoking. This really, really bad thing that kills a lot of people. And I think it is incredibly insulting for the government to tell people what they can and cannot do, but also to assume that adults are entirely unaware of the fact that smoking is so bad for them. I mean, for goodness sake, it is already all over the packaging. They are fully aware of the fact. If you are a smoker and you are not aware of the fact that smoking is bad for you, I think you need to get your head checked, because it is very much so clear across the board.
And there are surveys on this. This is well known. I've seen one a while ago where people were asked, how do you rate the risk of lung cancer and whatever other health effects there may be on a scale from, I think, 0 to 6 or so. And the average value is always 5 point something. So most people, if anything, overestimated. And it's just universally known that smoking is a health risk. You can no longer make the argument that maybe early days in the 50s you could have made that there may be risks that are just not widely known, or that you need, maybe that was an initial justification for funding this industry of public health awareness workers.
Action on smoking on health is taxpayer funded. It is funded by the government, and some of their work is very, very helpful. Some of their polling is actually quite helpful, and some of that is actually quite interesting and useful. Chris and I used it in our paper last year, A Rapid Solution. However, they are funded by taxpayers, and they are funded to literally advocate for these interventionist policies. They continuously recommend the government do this, and I think it's really interesting that now we're seeing other sort of public bodies, or trade unions even. The BMA this week came out with a paper on vaping, and said that because vaping is an epidemic, quote unquote, amongst children, which is just factually not true. There is such a small percentage of children that actually vape. There are double the number of 11 to 17-year-olds that drink alcohol regularly than vape regularly, but no one is considering banning vaping for everyone. So you end up with these very different bodies that come in and say, actually, the way that we solve all of these different problems is by the government telling you what you can and cannot do. It is also based on the assumption that if the government tell you not to do something, people listen. There will be a huge black market if the government were to completely ban tobacco. And we saw this in Bhutan, we saw this in South Africa. We know this is what happens when the government makes a product that is already legal, that more than 5 million people in the British population use regularly, and they make it illegal. It's not going to stop them. They will find the product illegally, and that'll be more dangerous, and the government will lose out on the tax revenue.
That's right. After all of that, I'm glad that Kristian has a very cheery final item for us. No, I'm joking, of course. Kristian.
Yes, I'm currently reading this book here, old classic. It's from 1985. It's not technically an IEA publication, so it doesn't have our logo on it, but it was edited by Arthur Selden, who was then the editorial director, and an introduction by Friedrich Hayek. And of course, some familiar faces here, some of them are still very much around. This is about what was then called the New Right. I guess we would just call it classical liberalism, but it was classical liberalism had basically disappeared for a while and was rediscovered in this form. And they just talk about, these are 20 thinkers of what was then called the New Right, and they explain their political thinking, their philosophy in their own words. A lot of it still reads quite well today. I don't know whether it was meant to be timeless, but a lot of it just was. It's a basic introduction to some of the things that still motivate us today. So you get a good initial overview of the Chicago school, the Austrian school, public choice economics. That kind of, for us in this neck of the woods, that's our daily bread and butter. As is often the case, the parts that have not aged so well are the optimistic parts. You can still sense, so they're not saying we, the New Right, we've won the argument, but there is a sense of optimism. Understandably, in 1985, they thought, well, we're getting somewhere finally. Some stuff is happening, and the future is ours, future is bright. It looks a bit different today. That, broadly speaking, a liberal is somebody who is right-wing on economics, and left-wing on social issues, which was the formula which also underpins the different versions of the political compass. And it was true for a long time. When I started to think about politics, it still worked quite well for me. Worked until maybe a couple of years ago quite well. It's no longer true today, though, because nowadays as liberals, would you say you're left-wing on social issues? No, nowadays left-wing on social issues in favor of cancel culture, woke authoritarianism, and all that, what we just talked about, the nanny state, if anything. But would you call yourself right-wing on economic issues? I'm guessing not, because what does that mean in practice other than just trying to block things through the planning system and going full NIMBY on everything? That's what the right is nowadays. So this rule of thumb, but useful formula that was a thing in the 80s, and for much longer than that, useful for a long time, is broken down now.
So the right has lost the kind of that free market ethos that animated it probably for much of the second half of the 20th century. The left, of course, they might have abandoned socialism, but they believe basically in kind of a bureaucratic economy. Lots of planning, not maybe central planning, not maybe 5-year plans, but a great deal of planning and a great deal of intervention. So neither of those are free market on economics. And then on the social side, yes, you've got the left, and they have this sort of woke authoritarianism, as you say, the nanny state stuff. But that is replicated in a subtly different but fundamentally the same way on the right often. So, I mean, you've had governments of the right who have been just as nanny statist as those on the left. And very often, you do have that kind of rebellion against political correctness, say, on the right. But do they actually stick to their guns on free speech? Or do they start to think, actually, I like those powers the left is using to silence and harass its opponents. We should do the same when we're in power. And so you get kind of economic interventionism and a kind of social authoritarianism at both poles of the political spectrum. And personally, this is not actually my prediction. I'm disturbed that it's Steve's prediction because he keeps being proved right. I don't think that things necessarily have to get this bad. Well, they will get this bad. But there is a scenario in which the people who are classically liberal, it's not just that they're somewhat uneasy in either political camp because they're always disagreeing on half of their views. It's that they can't find anyone to agree with any of their views in the two main political camps that dominate debate. That would be a very scary situation to be in. Obviously, part of the reason that organisations like the Institute of Economic Affairs exist is to try and make sure that debate doesn't go completely in that direction, and to make sure that people who believe in free markets and individual liberty and spontaneous order, that view is represented, and that the research agenda continues, and we can show empirically this is the best way to organise society. But yes, it does seem a little bleak at the moment when you look at politics, not just in Britain, but in many other developed countries around the world.
And just on that point, I mean, in F.A. Hayek's Constitutional Liberty, at the end, the essay, Why I'm Not a Conservative, he outlines that, obviously classical liberalism and liberalism itself is very different to conservatism. But he also says at the end of the essay that conservatives and liberals classical liberals have historically been in coalition with one another to fight against the authoritarianism of the socialists. That is sort of assuming that economics matters more than culture. And I think that we are increasingly in a position where actually on the economy there seems to be a very bad consensus across both sides of the political aisle, and culture is where these differences in politics seem to be realising. Well,
I hate to be the optimistic one because this is very out of character. But there were some good things happening as well, especially on when I said that I wouldn't call myself economically right-wing these days, because for me that just stands for the main policy theme of the right is just NIMBYism, and that's the only thing that's been consistent under the Conservative government 14 years. But there is a counter-reaction to that now, the NIMBY movement, which is mostly centre-left aligned nowadays, but I'd say why not, wherever it comes from. These may be people who may not get there through free market reasoning, but NIMBYism has reached a stage where it's become a bottleneck for the economy in general. So I was on Tom Harwood's GB News show a few months ago where a very easy interview. He showed a couple of clips of politicians just blocking things or news headlines. A data center blocked, a film studio blocked. You had various proposals. You had some investor coming saying, I want to do this, I want to do that. You had some local NIMBYs saying, no. And then he asked me, well, why is the economy not going? He had basically given the answer already. So it's reached that bottleneck stage. But that also means if somebody is against that, even if it's not for classical reasons, that person is an ally, and we should support that.
And it's not just on the Yimmie. I mean, Yimmieism is part of it, but there is this small but growing sort of progress movement, if you want to use that term, which isn't that. I mean, there are probably quite a lot of classical liberals, but there are also people from the soft left in there as well. What they fundamentally believe in is a kind of dynamism.
Yeah.
And there would be differences. There'd be people who are much more economically interventionist or who want to subsidize science to drive progress and stuff, for example, where I might disagree. But nevertheless, this is a small but growing group, as I say, but it's also a group, I think, and an ethos that has, if not massive popular appeal, very significant elite appeal. And it's something that I can see if it continues to progress, if that movement continues to grow, and the research can be built up behind it and everything, and that kind of coalition can grow, maybe that is a third point on a triangle, and you might have the two kind of left authoritarians and right authoritarians, and then you can have people who maybe might have considered themselves centrists for a long time, or on the centre-left, or on the centre-right, the classical liberal, but create a slightly different political movement, which is all about freedom and dynamism and progress and a brighter, more optimistic future. And actually, one of the things that you wrote about this book and the argument you've just made on CapEx this week, and you talked about the right's kind of economic ideology now. First of all, not being a stated ideology, but being a revealed ideology. Yeah. And that is one of NIMBYism, of just being against anything changing. But you made the point, which I think is probably quite astute, that this is downstream of politics becoming much more determined by demographics.
Yes.
That basically the right has become the baby boomer political party. And these are people who are largely retired. In many cases, they're quite well off. You reach a certain stage in life and a certain level of comfort, right? And you don't want things to change. Of course not, And I don't mean this to offend any of our older viewers and listeners. But that's probably not where the dynamism in society is coming from. But if that's the most powerful, most important electoral bloc, you can understand why politics responds the way it does.
I mean, pensioners are some of the most politically switched on demographics in the entire country. And I think we do have to also make the point that actually as time moves on, as everybody enters into the journey of life and the end of it, that particular block will be less politically important, and actually maybe this more optimistic dynamism might actually take a foothold in politics. Kristian, Tom, thank you both very, very much for joining me today on the IEA podcast, and thank you to all of you for listening as well.